Hi, everybody. Today is Thursday, March 6th, 2025, and our friend Graham Fuller is back with us. Welcome back, Graham.
Thank you, Nima.
We had some sort of technical problems before coming up. That was that was what happened, and sorry for that. But Graham, let's get started with what has happened between Donald Trump and European Union together with Ukraine. Here is what Zaluzhny today said about the situation that the Times reported that Zaluzhny is talking about the US is destroying the world order. And he mentions that NATO is facing huge challenges that may be the end of NATO. How do you see? Do you think is NATO cracking from the inside?
Yes, I think it is cracking up. NATO, essentially, European foreign policy is NATO. And without NATO, there is no European foreign policy. I'm also noticing that many people in the U.S. and elsewhere are talking about now America abandoning its allies. This is a very clever device, I think, on the part of Washington, because this system of allies is essentially the American system of foreign policy control. If you have allies, you control them. So there is no European foreign policy. The Europeans, for essentially 50, 60 years, have no independent foreign policy. It's all tied to NATO. Therefore, I think with the possibility of U.S. pulling out of NATO or certainly abandoning Ukraine, the Europeans don't know what to do. They have no other recourse. They have no other policy. They have no other system, or they have no other organization. They have not seriously thought about what their own policies and interests should be in Europe. So I would say NATO is essentially not so much the U.S. is abandoning Europe and NATO, but the NATO is essentially the device for American control and domination of European foreign policy. I should add, Nima, also that's true around the world, is that America's device for foreign policy domination and powerful control is through the system of alliances. The alliances are not really so much to help the other people who are out there. The alliance is really to help build a structure, an American structure of control and domination of those policies. So if anything is happening, America is losing its control or giving up its control, perhaps, of these countries. But these countries are not being abandoned. They, in a sense, are being freed.
Do you think that they're willing to have some sort of independence in the European Union? I'm talking about the European countries particularly. Do they really want to be independent from the United States?
I think at this point they are scared, terrified, because they have no other alternative. They have never thought about an alternative. They have no mechanisms for an alternative. So this meeting in London the other day, run by Keir Starmer, was really a joke. I mean, for one thing, these countries don't even have anything to contribute seriously militarily. Maybe France does slightly, but military specialists, and I'm not a military specialist as such, but military specialists point out that Europe is very poor on its available troops, and especially the UK. So I don't know what Europe will do, but they may need to rethink entirely their place in Europe and their relationship with Russia, which I would have to say I think is ultimately a very good idea. Russia has long been part of the European order, centuries in one way or another, off and on. And Europe has very deep, important economic and social and cultural ties with Russia. So They have, they're lost at the moment.
Can we put Europe as a united sort of mindset? Is that when we talk about Europe, who are we talking about? Are we talking about France, Germany, even during the war in Ukraine, when every each and every party on the part of the Western countries were unified, were some sort in line with the policy of the Biden administration, we had the drastic differences between substantial differences between Olaf Scholz and Emmanuel Macron. Right now, with Donald Trump and the new administration, we cannot imagine that would improve, that would get better, and they're going to get along with each other. Who are these European countries? Are they going to get along with each other? Do they have an understanding of having some sort of unity among them without the United
Well,
States?
I think if we are talking about geopolitics, we might talk about two Europes, not just one. The first Europe would be the classic early NATO stage, which was essentially Western Europe, Germany, France, Italy, Netherlands, Belgium, that kind of thing. But I think those countries have a fairly good understanding of each other. But the major change came when, with the acceptance of Eastern European states into NATO. At the time, many observers felt that this might be a dangerous step for NATO because perhaps the security interests of Eastern Europe are very different. If we talk about countries like Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, maybe Poland as well, but these countries are going to be permanently nervous, permanently scared of the giant Russian presence next to them. And there is nothing that can be done. This is where God placed them in geography. We've talked about this before, I think, maybe, Nima, but if you live next to a great power, life is not comfortable. And if you ask the Mexicans, ask the Canadians who live next to the United States. I think I've mentioned before, one former Mexican president said, "Poor Mexico, so far from God and so close to the United States." If you live next to Russia, like Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, and maybe Poland, you are going to be permanently nervous. If you live in Kashmir or Nepal or Sri Lanka, you are going to be permanently nervous about India and India's great power. If you live next to China, if you live in if you live in Vietnam, if you live in Taiwan, if you live in Cambodia, all of these, you are going to be permanently nervous. This is just a reality, and it's too bad, but it is the reality. So when you have three or four countries permanently nervous and permanently clutching on to US to help strengthen itself, it's a very different kind of NATO than it is with France, Germany, Italy, Austria, et cetera, which have some self-confidence in the situation. But right now, Europe, the United States is essentially almost hostage to the interests of the Baltic states and perhaps Poland, because they will never want to be independent. They're scared of being alone. So I'm not sure how you put together these two NATOs into one piece. But I would say, I think it's also rather, I've heard some commentators say that the Europeans are afraid that without a big American military presence, that the Europeans may go back to quarreling among themselves or even fighting among themselves, as they have in the past. I think that's a very sad argument. If Europe, especially Western Europe, which is arguably one of the most civilized and advanced states, a group of states in the entire world, with long history of dealing with each other in diplomacy, if these states cannot get together and work together without the United States, then I really wonder what Europe is all about at all. It should not have to be dependent upon an American presence for them to get along with each other. But yes, there is some hard work. They're going to have to sit down together, talk about their interests, especially talk about their relationship with Russia. Britain's relationship with Russia is different than Germany's, and obviously different from Estonia. But they've got to talk about this new world. We are entering a new era. And Trump has opened the door to that new era, for better or for worse. But I think it is a necessary new era, because the old era is tired and essentially built on aggressive intentions on the part or on essentially on military relationships, which are not healthy.
Graham, you pointed a very crucial and important issue that it seems to me that you're on the point that when you say that they're afraid of themselves, I'm talking about European countries. That's why they need a Russian enemy to make them unified. The Russian enemy should exist. It's so important in terms of their unity. When Russia is not there as an enemy, then where is the unification? Where is the unity among the European countries, even between the United States and Europe? Here comes the question: are they really? Because yesterday Emmanuel Macron was talking about Russia, and he says that by 2030 Russia would be a huge superpower with a military. They're gonna increase their arms, their forces, and all of that. That's a threat to Europe. Do you really think that Russia is an enemy? Is there any sort of reference in the history that shows Russia is their enemy? Is Russia is attacking them, not them attacking Russia? Can we have any sort of link between today and the history? That's why they're thinking this way, or they're just making this because they know that there is no unity within the European countries.
Well, if there's no unity, they certainly are capable of making unity. There's no reason why, as I said, these highly sophisticated countries with a common European culture in so many respects, there's no reason why they cannot cooperate if they wish. Also, Nima, I think you raised a very interesting question of enemy. Enemy is in many ways a choice. Um, I just mentioned John Mearsheimer in this regard. I am a huge admirer of John Mearsheimer. His brave and bold book about the Israeli lobby in the U.S. is extraordinary book. And John Mearsheimer's analysis of Ukrainian and Middle East policy is terrific. But I think John Mearsheimer's ideas about his concepts, his theories, I disagree with strongly. He has this idea somehow that if you have great power A and great power B, that they are going to have to be at each other's throats, that they are going to have to fight. This is not. Countries have agency. They have choice. If you look at the history of struggles in Europe, this has been all over the place over the past several hundred years. I think we've maybe talked about this before, but the Britain and France were bitter enemies for a very long time, struggling over control of North America. Then Germany and France were at each other's throats, and then Germany and England became very hostile. There was a hostility against Napoleon for a long time. But what I'm saying is things change, and you can choose to make them change if you wish. I do not see why it is not possible for European states to develop new relationships, either singly, each one on its own, or in a group, or both together, however you want to do it, with Russia. There's no reason why this cannot be done. And that is essentially what Trump now very boldly is trying to do with Russia. I don't want to get into an argument about Trump and domestic policies. That's a whole other issue. But if we look at Trump's very, very creative thinking on this issue, he's essentially trying to say, why do we have to be at war? But Nima, if I tell you that you are my enemy and I announce that you are my enemy, even if you maybe possibly might like me, if I tell you you are my enemy, you are going to feel hostile. You are going to feel threatened. So the United States essentially over the past 50 years has been identifying Russia as the enemy. The Soviet Union, I grant, was a particular ideological issue, but nonetheless, this is US foreign policy essentially depends on identification of enemies and therefore trying to pull coalitions of smaller states around these enemies to support and work with the United States. I would, in some ways, I call this the constant search for an enemy, a constant search for an ability to create new alliances. We that I think can be a recipe for confrontation if these alliances are viewed as hostile. I don't see why Europe can't get along with present day Russia. And just one other point, if you'll permit me to say, if we look at the history of Western Europe and Russia, Russia has essentially invaded Western Europe twice, seriously twice. The first time was when Napoleon invaded Russia and went all the way to Moscow and burned down Moscow. And the Russian army finally organized itself and chased Napoleon out of Russia back into Europe. And the Russian army followed all the way into France and became involved in European politics for a while. But they were chasing Napoleon out. The second occasion of Russian deep invasion was, of course, with Hitler. Hitler invaded Russia, virtually destroyed St. Petersburg, destroyed huge parts of Russia, killed 25 million Russian people. Soviet Union chased them out, and the Soviet army went all the way to Germany, to Berlin, chasing out Hitler's troops. So on both of these occasions, I think that we can say that the Russian movement of troops into Europe was based on some kind of very powerful military provocation. And so I don't think it is necessarily automatically in the Russian genetic character that it's going to have to attack Russia, attack Europe. It's worked with Russia and been part of Russia, been part of Europe culturally, politically, etc., for quite a long time, and it could happen again. It will happen again, I hope. But
I need
not if Washington insists that Russia is the enemy and we have to maintain NATO against Russia. That's a guarantee for hostility.
I think they need to look what's going on between Russia and China, which shows that since Putin came to power and he tried to be closer to the West, but he was not that close to China. There were huge differences between the two countries. But right now, they're getting better and better, just improving their relationship. The West was, but the West is losing, and the way that they're just pushing Russia to the east. On the other hand, you see the new administration in Washington, as you mentioned, it wants to just change the whole game, the nature of the game. They don't want Russia to be on the Chinese side, on the part of China and helping China. They want Russia to be at least in the middle to make some sort of balance. Here comes the question: what would be the role of the European countries in that sort of calculation? What does the United States, how does the United States see Europe in that picture?
Well, Nima, I know you are familiar with the Russian goal and aim of creating a new security architecture all the way from the Ural Mountains to Spain. This goes back to Gorbachev with the beginning of with the collapse of the Soviet Union. He had a vision. Even Ronald Reagan had some good discussions with Gorbachev, but that was still during the Soviet period. But Russia has said it is not good enough to have. I mean, Europe. It does not believe in a divided Europe. Preferably, there can be a united Europe with the security arrangements that take into consideration the security interests of every single European country. That means from Spain to Russia, mechanisms for coordination, for discussion, for diplomacy, for arrangements about how military relations between these countries, limits perhaps to the kinds of amounts of weaponry that has existed. We've seen treaties in the past on nuclear weapons. Russia has said we don't. NATO is essentially hostile to us, but if we can have a unified agreement with across all of Europe, then we have the basis for a long foundation. I think you'll also notice that Russia has quite bluntly rejected the idea of a ceasefire in Ukraine simply because it says that does not solve any long-term problem. The long-term problem is creating hostile blocs in Europe against Russia when a unified European security policy would largely eliminate that problem. Of course, there are always going to be tensions. That's what diplomacy is for. But to have two military blocs identifying each other as enemies is not particularly sensible. As you know, Russia abolished the Warsaw Pact with the fall of the Soviet Union, but the West did not abolish NATO. So, because NATO was a very powerful instrument for Washington to control Europe, and that's why it never happened. But I think, hopefully, thinking imaginatively, that NATO can be reduced and slowly eliminated, and new security architecture emerging in Europe that includes Russia. I don't think we are ever going to split Russia and China entirely away and make them enemies. That's not going to happen either, I don't think. But we've really pushed Russia into China's lap in every sense, in ways that maybe even make China uncomfortable. China is not totally comfortable with this war in Ukraine, but it's trying to help Russia because it feels Russia is under heavy Western pressure. But so it could be a new world, a new security order.
It seems that Donald Trump is trying to do both. And before, if you remember, before start talking with Russia, he tried to talk with Xi in China in terms and in convincing him not to help Russia in Ukraine before coming to Russia and talking with Putin, which didn't work. And right now, it seems that they know the reality of the relationship between Russia and China. That's why they're trying to strengthen the relationship between the United States and Russia. That which would go ahead.
No, I think that is the intention, Nima. You're exactly right. But I think it's a bit of a crude and unimaginative, maybe one could say impoverished view of what European security could be over the long run. As I say, I think Washington will not succeed in driving a wedge between Russia and China, but certainly Russia, America's improvement, Washington's improvement of relations with Russia is all to the good. It lessens the danger, the serious danger of even nuclear war, as many people had talked about months ago. People were actually discussing the possibility of use of tactical nuclear weapons. So I think perhaps Russia's and China's relationship will remain for sure to some degree, but we shouldn't think necessarily in terms of a zero-sum game that Russia is with us and against China, or Russia is with China against us. That's a bit crude. The world is more complicated than that. Interests are more complicated than that.
It seems that you're done with the zero-sum game of the United States.
Not yet, Nima, but hopefully.
At least when it comes to Russia and China, because they're not gonna give up on the relationship they're experiencing right now. And here comes the question. Here is the main doubt on the part of Europeans, in my opinion. What does the United States want to do with Russia, and how are they gonna transform? How are they gonna change the game between the East and between the West and Russia? Is that gonna be the new mineral deal that Donald Trump is talking about, which is located, they're talking about rare earth and minerals that are not, that the United States needs to compete with China. And this is the future. This is about AI, this is about semiconductors, chips, all of that, which can bring some sort of mutual understanding, some sort of mutually beneficial relationship for the two parties.
Yes, that's an interesting point, Nima, you make. I would have to say that the mineral deal, which has not so far come off, it may yet, I don't know, but it would perhaps be the beginning, the first glimpse, if you will, for understanding of what a new European relationship could be, in which your economic relations would be extraordinarily important among that. So it could be that the mineral deal is more than just a crude attempt to buy Ukraine, or for America to establish itself in Ukraine, but simply, yes, the beginning of a recognition of much mutual dependence in the codependence in the area. We see this also very much in the question of Russian energy supplies to Europe. You know, we've all seen that America's determination to destroy, America's actual destruction of the pipeline between Russia, energy pipeline, gas pipeline between Russia and Europe, especially Germany, was a catastrophe. This has destroyed, in many ways, the cheap energy supply that Germany especially desperately needed. And we've now seen that German industry is in trouble. It's in deep trouble. It's moved some of its factories out of Europe, which cannot be good for the European economy. It cannot be good for European labor policies. But so I would argue that these ties of this pipeline issue, for example, or the minerals issue, can be bonds that they can be ties which link these countries together and make it much more difficult, much more undesirable for them to quarrel. I mean, that should be one of the basic ideas. And here is where Washington's deliberate destruction of that pipeline, and stunningly, total silence from Europe. Not one single European power has criticized Washington and this incredible event, which I gather was also a major environmental event with a massive release of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, massive release. So anyway, I would hope that the concept of energy ties, mineral ties, other industrial ties will help bring Europe together more closely, and possibly maybe China as well. But China, of course, is a very different issue, because we have the zero, we still have a zero sum game potentially with China, with everyone saying, well, the so-called liberal view is, well, we have to make peace with Russia so that we can face China, because that's the real enemy, and that's the enemy that we have to organize Japan and South Korea, and Philippines and Taiwan and all. We have to organize them and build uh, build alliances against China. That's in many ways that's a crude continuation of what's been going on with Russia so far. But I'm happy, I'm delighted that we may be able to change the game in Ukraine, which changes the game in Europe. I'm less happy if the result is that now we can comfortably get ready to go to conflict with China. Again, coming back to Mearsheimer, I think Mearsheimer, who is a great analyst in so many ways, I think Mearsheimer is frankly crazy if he thinks that war with China has to be inevitable, because simply we have two great powers coming together here. He says that about Russia in some respects, but especially about China. It's not necessary. It's not written in stone. Countries have choices, nations have choices, and they have exercised these choices off and on over many, many years. So I would argue that we need to have this broad recalibration of the entire security system and view of the world. I don't know whether Trump is going to go there. It's early still, but Ukraine could be a great beginning.
Remembering the meeting between Donald Trump and Zelensky and the way that he treated Zelensky, and Zelensky was insisting on his point of view in terms of the conflict, in terms of how to bring the conflict to an end. And when you see that Donald Trump has announced that they're not going to send weapons, they're not going to transfer intelligence to Ukrainians, and the way that the reaction from the European countries, they're going to support whatever happens with the United States. And today we've learned that it seems that the United States behind the scene is negotiating with Zelensky's opposition. I know we're talking about Poroshenko, Timoshenko, maybe Zaluzhny, the former commander-in-chief of Ukraine that is now his ambassador, the Ukrainian ambassador to the United Kingdom. And these are the options on the table for the United States to make a new, to force Ukraine to have a new presidential election. Do you think that the meeting between Donald Trump and Zelensky was a setup they knew that Zelensky would not agree with them on the issue of Ukraine and the way that they're picturing the situation in Ukraine? That's why they treated him that way, to make these sort of moves, not sending military intelligence, forcing them and replacing Zelensky, and finding some people in Ukraine who are capable of doing that.
I agree with you. I think in some sense it was a setup, and we see that more clearly when, rather than holding these serious discussions in the Oval Office, they were held in public in front of TV cameras and journalists to witness the rejection of Zelensky's strategic ideas by Trump in public. And it was obviously a kind of humiliation. I mean, I think Ukraine's policies have been very wrong, but I feel very sorry for Ukraine as a country. The United States has essentially led Ukraine into this war by insisting on the inclusion of Ukraine in NATO. I believe Zelensky and Ukraine sometime earlier, in a year or two earlier, had said they did not have to be part of NATO necessarily. I'd have to check my facts, but certainly by pushing this, by pressuring Ukraine to accept a NATO up against the Russian border guaranteed a conflict in which Ukrainians would die. No Americans would die. No Russians. I mean, sorry, no Ukrainians. Let me start again. No Americans would die. No Frenchmen would die. No Germans would die. Just Ukrainians, and of course, a lot of Russians as well. And that was the goal of the operation. But yes, I feel very sorry for Ukrainian losses and for Zelensky, who has had a very rough time. But he got caught between great power politics, and that's never happy. Frankly, I don't think there is any diplomatic solution if we look at what the Russian position is. Russia has basically said, we don't want a ceasefire. That does not solve anything. It simply pushes the problem forward to another day. And we certainly do not want any peacekeepers in Ukraine, European peacekeepers in Ukraine, because that is simply another word for NATO forces, which for Russia is an absolute no-no. Absolute no-no. So Russia's position, and I have to say, I think there's some merit to it. Sorry. There's some merit to it that they're saying we have to get a common European-wide security arrangement for the future, forever, if you will. That we don't, and if we don't do that, we are just bound to have a reopening of the Ukraine war again at some point and fighting over Ukraine's position. They want permanent neutrality, like Austria is, permanent neutrality, and this new security architecture, which is doable. But Washington certainly does not want that because it weakens its hold, its grip on NATO. And I think NATO at this point is still in a state of shock, unable to grasp what's going on, the magnitude of these changes, and the hard work that Europe will face in trying to reconsider its relations with Russia. But I don't see there's any other way out of this. No negotiations, short of those terms we just talked about. No negotiations are going to work. Then there's nothing that the remains of NATO forces can do to change this, in my view.
Graham, when it comes to the policy of tariffs on the part of Donald Trump, here is what the Chinese embassy in the United States put out yesterday on their social media, on X, if I'm not mistaken, on X, yeah. If war is what the United States wants, be it a tariff war, a trade war, or any other type of war, we're ready to fight it till the end. This is the Chinese embassy in the United States. What are they trying to say? What are they trying to communicate with the United States by this sort of post on the part of the Chinese embassy in the United States, in your opinion?
I think fundamentally this is the rejection of a foreign policy that is seen in terms of zero-sum game. That has certainly been Washington's approach to Russia, and it is seemingly very much part of America's approach to China. So China seems here to be saying, you, America, are in the business of trying to weaken us either militarily or arms race or in tariff wars, economic wars. That's not the game that we want to play, and we reject that. It's an effort to stop, to close American mind to this idea of zero-sum game. It's going to be tough because the very encouraging signs that we see in Ukraine are are excuse me, are justified by some in Washington as a chance to deal with the real enemy, which is China and not Russia. That's very dangerous. So obviously China is already foreseeing that argument now coming into play. If we really get a peaceful settlement across Europe, that would be an amazing thing. If we see that happening, China feels that it will then be with the major American target in a zero-sum game, and they're not going to accept that to the extent that they can block that.
Yeah. Graham, before wrapping up this session, I want to know what's your take on Donald Trump again posting on his social media that they're going to be a hell in Gaza if they don't release hostages, they don't release prisoners, hostages, or whatever. And what the last time he was threatening Hamas this way, he didn't do anything. Is he gonna is this the same sort of game? Is he trying to put pressure on Hamas? Because he's talking about the weapons, the bombs that the United States gave to Israel, that Israel to finish the job, as he mentions in this tweet, in this post. How do you see the policy in Gaza? I actually go ahead. Let's.
There was a news item just late yesterday, I believe, that said that Donald Trump's Middle East coordinator was in Doha, in Qatar, meeting with Hamas senior officials. If that's the case, that is very encouraging. If I were Netanyahu, I would be very nervous about that. I should just say, by the way, although seemingly Trump has Netanyahu's back and is seemingly going to support forever our Israeli ally, if I were Netanyahu, I would not trust Trump entirely. Trump is very, as we all know, very given to negotiations, transactional in his approach to things. And I think if Trump feels that he can have a transaction that will work with, at least temporarily or seriously, with Hamas, that he might go that route. At the same time, it's typical of Trump to threaten Hamas. Nobody can guess what would happen, but we do know that essentially Trump does not want war. This is one strange and important, very important feature of Trump's approach to things. So, by the way, I might just add here, this relates particularly to Ukraine, but not exclusively. I have the sense that Trump very early on is hoping that he's lining himself up for the Nobel Peace Prize. If he can bring peace into Ukraine, God knows he would deserve the Nobel Peace Prize. I think particularly because he resents Obama, and Obama got a peace prize by doing nothing except getting elected with a handsome face, and it was very exciting to see a Black American president. But Obama basically did not really do very much for peace. So, and Trump dislikes Obama. So I just sense that Trump is looking for that award. And okay, you can say Trump is doing it because he's an egotist. Fine. If that's what it takes to put an end to the war in Ukraine, go for it. That's great. So I'm not sure what's happening in the Middle East. It's much tougher because I can see the end, even the end of NATO, bringing about slowly a brand new security relationship in Europe. In the Middle East, my sense is that Netanyahu is determined to fulfill the entire ethnic cleansing of Palestine, all Palestinians, and we don't even know where the borders, the natural borders, if you will, of Israel are. God, I mean, quite literally, God knows where those borders are because God wrote about it, or it's in the holy books. Where the Jews have been historically speaking, but otherwise, many Middle Eastern states are very nervous about this. Even Saudi Arabia is nervous because there's some historical reference to Jews having a settlement in Saudi Arabia, certainly in Jordan, certainly in Lebanon, certainly in Syria, maybe even in Yemen. So there's no limit, in a sense, to the geographical ambitions of Israeli expansionism. I'm not saying they're going to expand to all those areas, but there is biblical justification for it, and to some Israeli leaders that is a very important factor. So I don't see how Trump is really going to be able to crush those Israeli long-term ambitions, except by playing very, very hard ball with Israel, which is difficult. We all know with the Israeli lobby, it's extremely difficult. But I'm a little bit skeptical about how far Trump can go in that regard, but we will see. But anyway, Bibi should be nervous. He should be nervous because Trump is unpredictable. I think Bibi was shocked when Trump said that the U.S. would take over Gaza. Because he didn't expect this. Gaza is for Israel. It's not for America. It's for Israel. It's for Bibi. So, I mean, this is a taste, the beginning, the foretaste, if you will, of Israel's dealing with the unpredictable America and unpredictable Trump down the road.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Graham, for being with us today. Great pleasure, as always.
Well, my pleasure, Nima. Very interesting and important topics. Take care.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.